All right, hello ornithology students. I just finished my lunch, so it seems like an appropriate time to talk about the dining lives of birds. We're going to get into their diet and some of their physiology that's tied to their diet and digestion. And so an interesting topic. I think they're all interesting topics. Maybe I should stop saying that because you're like, oh, all right, I always say that. Okay, let me see if I can get my screen shared here. Okay, let's share this and then swap this. Okay, so here's a good place to start. I think this is an interesting question. If you recall, birds do not have teeth, and you're probably aware they don't have hands, therefore they're not very good with a knife and fork. So basically everything that a bird eats is swallowed whole. They don't chew their food. And so imagine how our digestive system is specifically tailored to accepting food that's been partially physically processed in our mouths. We chew it up before we swallow it. And things might be a little different if everything you ate was whole. And that's the way it is with birds. And we're going to find that that is how their digestive systems are different. So mammals, and all mammals, usually do some form of chewing or some sort of what we would just call physical processing of their food. So they physically process it first through some version of chewing, and then they chemically process it second. So the physical processing is happening, at least to start, in the mouth, and then it goes down into the stomach for chemical processing, and then more chemical processing in the intestines. For birds, obviously, it's different from that because of their lack of teeth, because of their inability to really process it very significantly. There are some, some ability to process it minimally, but not as much as we have. So they do a version of chemical digestion first, and then physical digestion second. Now, this is probably a less efficient system, but it is what they're stuck with. This is the way it works for them. So let's learn how it works. Okay, so what we're gonna encounter some new vocabulary. They have some anatomical features that mammals lack, most notably a crop and a gizzard. A few other things as well, like a cloaca. But a crop and a gizzard are terms you want to learn and understand how they work and why they have them. Okay, let's look at the digestive tract of birds. There's tremendous variation based largely on their diet. And what we're going to find, and this is true of mammals as well as it is of birds, is that birds that have a diet of primarily meat, meaning insects, meat, if anybody that has a diet of primarily animals has a fairly simple digestive system. And that's true in mammals as well. If you look at the digestive system of like a wolf that is exclusively carnivorous, it's very simple compared to herbivorous animals. And the reason for that is that meat is very easy for us to digest with enzymes. And we're all born with the capacity to synthesize these enzymes that digest meat, and it's easy. So here we have a swift, white-throated swift in this case, and their digestive system is about 3 times their body length. So what that means is that it's not very much longer than their body length. And you've probably heard stories of humans and how our intestines are all wound up in there. Versus an ostrich, right, which is a big bird, but ostriches are one of these rare birds that are mostly herbivorous, and they do eat some leaves in addition to seeds and other things. And again, their digestive system is much more complex because plants, especially vegetative parts of plants, are very difficult to digest. So there's variation in the size of the digestive system. And you probably don't think of it like this, but the digestive system really starts with the beak or the bill. And almost all birds have a bill that is specialized for the type of food that they eat. So their bill influences their diet influences their bill. We believe that over time their bills can change. It's a famous study of some birds on the Galapagos Islands, and they did show that if their diet changed over time, they showed a climactic change, so that harder seeds, were more abundant over a longer period of time, that the bill would actually slightly change in response to that. So that's how natural selection works. We won't get into all that detail. But so bills are specialized for the type of food they eat, and then there are some bills that also play a role in display and attracting a mate or warding off competitors. Lots of them contain specialized structures, like for filtering. There are some ducks that have kind of a filtering structure. I think that one on the top there, the third down from the top right, is that of a northern shoveler, or at least something similar to that. They've got these bills that are good for filtering, and then obviously the flamingo bill, and they're kind of filter feeders. We also see that some that have teeth-like structures, they're not teeth. They don't grow from a root. They don't grow, in the same way that teeth do, but they function like teeth in that, not that they can chew, but that they can kind of grip things. And then we all obviously see some that are structured for meat eating, and the woodpecker on the second down from the left, that's specialized for drilling into holes, and remarkable adaptations like the spoonbill on the bottom left, the roseate spoonbill, which lives down in the tropics and is found in Florida. So bills of all different sizes and shapes. So the food goes in through the bill, of course, that doesn't surprise you. And then it goes first into the crop. Okay, so the crop is primarily for food storage. And this is really important for some birds, especially birds in the winter. If you imagine the little teeny songbirds that live in Minnesota in the winter, a lot of people wonder how do they survive the night, because their metabolism is very high. And so if it's a very cold night and they don't have a blanket to wrap up in, as they don't, how do they eat enough food to survive every night? And one of the things we discovered is that they use their crop as food storage. So they'll eat a bunch of food and then store it in their crop. And in the crop, it's not really being very heavily digested. There's not a lot of chemical digestion going on there, so they can store it until their body decides it's time to release it, and then they release it and digest it and help them get through the night. Okay, so the crop regulates the flow of food through the digestive system, and it's a big storage place. And actually, this is kind of creepy, but I once banded a bird. I banded a lot of birds of prey, and occasionally, if a bird of prey has just eaten a meal, you can feel in their crop will feel full. You can actually measure it and kind of get a sense for how long it's been since they've eaten. But I remember once you could feel the bill of the bird that it had just eaten. The bill was kind of poking out. It was almost sharp. And you're like, oh, that's okay. Well, we know what they recently ate was some little bird with a sharp bill. Probably fortunate that it didn't puncture a hole in its crop. So there's one somewhat famous bird, really fascinating bird that lives down in Central America called the Hoatzin. And it is the only bird that it's kind of an honorary mammalian herbivore, and then it's got a chambered stomach, sort of similar to what we see in things like cattle that are herbivorous. And so their crop is sort of modified for digesting plant vegetation. And again, they're one of the very few birds whose diet is primarily composed of leaves. So they go through the crop, and then it goes into the stomach, and the stomach is where we start to see chemical digestion. So if you look at this picture, this hummingbird we see on the left, you don't see a big pouch like we do in mammals. So their stomach, which is kind of in two parts, which is the proventriculus and then the gizzard, they're not massive in size like we sometimes see in mammals that have a very large stomach for digestion. Okay, so the proventriculus is basically just a tube, and it's where digestive acids and enzymes are going to be secreted. So this is functioning very much like a secretory organ for digestion. So it's secreting gastric juices and digestive acids, extremely low pH, much like ours. So here we start to see chemical digestion after the crop, and then it goes into the gizzard, and the gizzard is where we start to see mechanical digestion. So if you know much about gizzards and things like chickens and turkeys, if you've ever dissected one or eaten one, you know that the gizzard is a really muscular organ. And so in birds, the gizzard is where things are starting to be processed. So we'll get to that in just a moment here. Again, the proventriculus, and here is a nice picture of a chicken digested, or a chicken's digestive system dissected out. So here we see the mouth, the esophagus, then it goes into the crop, and the proventriculus down below that, and then the gizzard below that again. So they're secreting enzymes here, and the bearded vulture, remarkably, it can digest bones. So it can digest a cow vertebra in 2 days. So these are extremely aggressive enzymes and acids. Sometimes the proventriculus is also stored where we see a little bit of regurgitation. So they'll process something in the gizzard and then regurgitate it back up into the proventriculus for further chemical digestion. So that's kind of how they're getting around this process of having the chemical first and then the physical. Well, sometimes they'll send it back up for more chemical. Okay, so then we said the gizzard, that is after the proventriculus, and this is part of the stomach basically, and it's very muscular, as I mentioned. Some people eat the gizzard, turkeys and chickens. It's extremely muscular, it's dark meat, and it's the site of most of the physical breakdown of the food. So it's the inside, and so you might ask, like, how can you physically process food if you just have a muscle, right? And that muscle is just squeezing, what's it doing? Well, the inside of that gizzard is covered with a keratin surface. Keratin is kind of like your fingernails, so it's kind of a hard surface. And then you're probably aware that many birds eat pebbles or grit. You'll see them on the side of the road picking at grit or pebbles or sand. And what they're doing is adding those little rocks, and they go into their gizzard, and they'll stay in their gizzard for a couple of days or sometimes even a couple of weeks. And those rocks will help to grind up the food as the gizzard is contracting, this muscular gizzard. By having those rocks and the sort of hard surface on the inside of the gizzard, when the gizzard contracts, it helps to grind up the food. So the gizzard is like the teeth of the bird. Okay. Now, what is interesting again, that if you are an insect-eating bird or a meat-eating bird, they don't have nearly as much of a gizzard because their food is easy to digest. But if you're a seed-eating bird, or if you're a plant-eating bird, but this is most true in seed-eating birds, then the gizzard is very well developed. Okay. So again, yeah, it's not as muscular in meat, insect, and fruit-eating birds. Then we have a liver and a pancreas, and these are kind of boring in that by boring, what I mean is they just act like the liver and the pancreas in most mammals. So they have pretty similar hormones, similar actions. They add digestive juices or enzymes. An enzyme, for those of you that are not science people, is a chemical that helps to catalyze a process. Basically, here it's the chemical breakdown of food into the carbohydrates and proteins and fats that are then going to go into the bird's body. So the liver and pancreas are kind of normal endocrine organs and do what liver and pancreas in mammals do. And then they have intestines that are similar to ours. They have a small intestine, a large intestine, and this is where there's further chemical breakdown, and this is where absorption happens. So, right, if everything happening in the crop and the proventriculus and the gizzard is getting ready for those meals to be digested, the intestine is where the sugars and fats and proteins then actually go from the digestive tract and enter into the bloodstream so that they can be delivered to the bird's muscles and organs and whatnot. And so we call that absorption. Okay, so intestines where absorption happening just like it is in mammals. And again, the intestines are longer in plant and grain-eating animals than they are in meat and insect-eating animals or fish-eating animals. One remarkable discovery of the past few decades is that their intestines can change length seasonally in response to their change in diet. And this is a common bird that we have around here, eastern kingbirds. I've seen these the past couple of days in my time out in the field. And eastern kingbirds, when they live up in Minnesota or northern United States during the summer, they're insect-eating birds, and they're part of the flycatcher family, so that doesn't surprise us that they eat flies and insects. But we were surprised when we went down to study them in the winter, when they spend their time in the tropics, that their diet changes and they eat a lot more fruit in the winter. And that surprised us because this family of flycatchers is known for eating insects. That's why we call them flycatchers. But their diet changes, and not surprisingly, their intestines changed as well. Maybe it was surprising to us, but now that I'm telling you, it's not surprising. So again, their intestines can change seasonally in response to their changing diet. Now, not all birds change their diet with the season, but the kingbird is one really remarkable example of one that goes from primarily insect eating to insect and fruit eating in the winter. Now, some, but not all birds have cica. And so if you look down at this picture, look to the far right of this picture, and you'll see two arrows coming off from cica, and those are just dead end sacs, and that's exactly what they are. They're dead end sacs at the very posterior of kind of the boundary between the large intestine and small intestine. And those sacs are not present in all birds. They're present in some, mostly birds that eat some sort of plant-based diet. And they're mostly absent in arboreal birds. Arboreal means sort of forest birds. They're birds that are living up in the canopy. So these add weight to the bird, but it gives them the ability to digest different foods. And they contain bacteria. Okay, so they contain bacteria that helps them digest their plant-based foods. Also helps them with absorption of water and protein. And so kind of interesting things that are present in some birds, missing in other birds, depending on their lives. So yep, water and protein absorption, and then bacterial breakdown of plant-based foods. And then if you go from there, you see that there's this large intestine, which is very small. And that probably won't surprise you. If you know anything about the large intestine, you know that the large intestine's job is to remove the fluid from the waste, right? So this is a little bit gross, but when your large intestine is not functioning well, it's when you're having loose stool, if you're having diarrhea or something. Oh, my large intestine's not getting its job done. So your large intestine is what takes the water and the liquid out of the waste. And in birds, they have mostly liquid waste, right? The bird poop that you think of that is on the curb of your car is not, it's a sort of a paste. So they don't have a very large intestine, but they do have a cloaca that helps to some degree in that process. Okay, so the cloaca then is an organ that humans have no equivalent of, or at least not, it doesn't function in the same way. And that the cloaca is an exit port that is shared between the excretory system, both the urine and the feces, in which birds it's sort of combined into both, and the reproductive system, right? So, and this we kind of have this in humans, I guess. It's similar, but it's not the same in that we don't have all three exit ports in the same hole. So in birds, you have three regions to the cloaca. The region closest to the large intestine is called the copperdium. That's the anterior region, and this is where the excrement from the digestive tract comes in. And then the urodium, and this is where the excrement from the urinary tract comes in. So there is sort of separate feces and urine, but it gets mixed together here. And this is where you get gametes from the reproductive tract also coming in. So that's where your sperm and your egg come in. And then the proctodeum is the outermost region, and this is where it's stored very temporarily. We said that they don't store very much waste like we do in our large intestine and in our bladder. So it's stored very temporarily. And then it controls the release. And so when the bird decides it's time to go to the bathroom, it's the muscular sphincter in the proctodeum that controls that process. And it's also the muscular sphincter. If you're not familiar with that term, a sphincter is a circular muscle. So we have sphincters that line our intestines and our anus as well. So that controls the release of the egg for the female and the sperm for the male as well. Okay, let's look at digestive efficiency. Let's get into physiology. I have always thought physiology is more interesting than anatomy. So birds have pretty high digestive efficiency. Hummingbirds, because their diet is basically sugar water, they can take in almost all of the sugar water that they drink gets turned into energy that's assimilated into their body. That's as high a number as I've seen for any animal on the planet. But again, they drink sugar water, so they're not wasting things here. Meat-eating birds, very efficient, again, because meat's easy to digest. So raptors, which are eating meat, or insectivores, which means those are insect-eating birds, roughly 70 to 90% of the energy in the meat that they eat is assimilated into their body. Granivorous birds, which means grain or seed-eating birds, roughly between 50 and 90% of the energy in seeds is assimilated, and that variation is primarily depending on the type of seed. Are they eating one that's easy to digest and very nourishing, or one that's harder to digest or just contains less energy? And then if we look at like leaf-eating animals, for mammals that are leaf eaters, we see that they, get 60 to 70% of the young plant matter, 30 to 40% of mature plant matter. That helps us understand why things like deer like to eat young plants and the tips of trees and branches and not wood. And that hoatzin that we talked about, that goofy looking Central American bird that mostly eats leaves, they're very good. They're efficient. 71% of the mature foliage that they eat, they assimilate into their body. Okay, so let's just switch gears a little bit into the study of bird metabolic systems. So let's just imagine three different groups of birds here. We have our songbird, which is an insect eater. We have the macaw on the left, which is probably mostly a fruit eater. And then we have the grouse down at the bottom, which is mostly a seed eater and maybe a little bit of plant life, other forms of plant life. Which of these birds has a harder time meeting their energy budget? Well, excuse me, I apologize for the yawning, getting up too early. It kind of depends, it kind of varies, right? The small bird has a high metabolic rate, but they eat really easy to digest things. The grouse has a lower metabolic rate, in part because it's just a bigger animal, but it eats things that are hard to digest. So it's never just as simple as saying, oh, this one has an easy time getting by and this one has a harder time. So we're going to think about this process overall, about their energy in versus energy out, and the study of energetics. And this is a study of what we call our metabolism. And you probably all heard this before, because we apply this to ourselves, and our metabolism changes, and metabolism varies from person to person. Some people can eat all they want and they stay thin, and some people gain weight very easily. You'll probably find that your metabolism changes in your life. For me, when I hit 30, my metabolism slowed down, and I found that I couldn't eat whatever I wanted when I was young, when I was a teenager, when I was in my 20s. I was thin and I had high metabolism, and it was almost impossible for me to gain weight. So, so your metabolism is sort of a holistic view of all your biochemical reactions that are happening within your body, and its end goal is to provide energy to your body in a usable form. And in birds and mammals, and other animals and plants for that matter, that energy in a usable form is a molecule called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. You don't need to memorize that, but just know that they're trying to make this energy-rich molecule, and that energy comes from digesting and processing, oxidizing the food that they eat, whether it's seeds or insects or whatever it may be. So that's your metabolism. And so what we're interested in is how fast does their metabolism work? At what rate are they able to produce ATP out of the food that they eat? So that's roughly your metabolic rate. And so we can measure that in a couple of different ways. We're very much interested in measuring metabolic rate, and we do this in humans as well. By far the most accurate way to do it is to measure the amount of heat that you produce. But the processes that we use to measure heat accurately is extremely clunky, and we almost never do it because it's so difficult to accomplish. part of the reason we don't do it is because there's another method that is nearly as accurate and is much easier to do. And so it's much more practical, especially in a laboratory environment. It's not very practical in the field environment. But you can measure oxygen consumption. And if you measure the oxygen consumption, then you get a good sense for the metabolic rate of an organism, because the amount of oxygen that is used is fairly consistent for the type of fuel that's being utilized. So whether you're digesting fat, or whether you're digesting sugar, or whether you're digesting protein, the amount of oxygen that's needed to create, a certain amount of ATP is fairly consistent. So this is what's commonly done. And one of my advisors, graduate advisors, my master's advisor, he did a lot of work like this, studying how birds survive the winter. And so he would capture them and he'd put them in a cold environment, and he would study how their metabolism would change. And he did that by measuring their oxygen consumption. So he actually would put them in a little paint can with tubes going in and tubes going out. And so he could measure the oxygen and carbon dioxide concentration going in and the amount coming out, and could ascertain how much oxygen was being used and how much carbon dioxide was being consumed or produced by the bird inside that can. Now there's another way to do it in the field, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but it's a process called doubly labeled water. And doubly labeled water is a water that has radioactive isotopes in it. It's harmless, but it allows physiologists to see how those radioactive isotopes, the hydrogen, or what we see here, D, or which stands for deuterium, which is basically, we call it heavy water, heavy hydrogen, and then this isotope of oxygen. See how it gets assimilated into an animal, so you give them the injection of doubly labeled water, and you let them go for a couple of days, and then you take a blood sample, and you can measure their metabolism over that time. Now, a less precise method, but very easy to accomplish, is what we call a time activity budget. And we're going to do this a little bit later in the week. I'm going to have you do a time activity budget to try and get a sense of the metabolic activities for a bird. So a time activity budget involves a couple steps, and we're not going to do all these steps. The first one assumes that you're going to measure the cost of certain activities in a lab with some precise instruments. So like, how much oxygen is it taking for a robin when they're just sitting on a branch resting? And how much oxygen are they consuming when they're hopping around? And how much oxygen are they consuming when they're flying? So you measure those things in the lab so that you know approximately how much energy is required. And then you just go out and watch that same animal in wild circumstances, and you watch them for 5 minutes or whatever it may be, and say, how much of their time did they spend singing or flying or hopping or resting or fighting or whatever it may be. And so you take that, you can then sum the cost for the time spent in each of those different behaviors or activities to give you a rough estimate of their metabolic rate. And so all these things put together, we have learned a lot about the metabolic rates of birds. And there are a lot of different factors which influence their metabolic rate. And one is their circadian phase. This probably won't surprise you. A much higher metabolic rate during the stage of the day when you're active and awake than when you're resting and sleeping. And so when you're resting or sleeping, metabolic rate's about 20% lower. It's similar in mammals. Your digestive state, we have something that we call specific dynamic action. And that's the amount of energy that's needed to digest your food. You probably don't think a lot about that, but when you eat food, it actually requires energy to digest your food. And so if you compare the metabolic rate of a bird sitting on a branch with no food in its stomach versus a bird sitting on a branch with food in its stomach, the metabolic rate is going to be higher for the bird with food in its stomach. Life history. So basically just your life history means, this is a term I probably should have defined better. It just means kind of what's your niche? What are the ways that bird gets by? So that includes things like, what type of food do you eat? And if you have a fruit diet, then you typically have a lower metabolic rate than a bird with a meat diet. And that's interesting. And some people think it's tied to, it might be a correlation that's tied to something else. Sex, we find that species show sexual dimorphism in metabolic rate. Sometimes the males are higher and sometimes the females are higher, and that probably doesn't surprise us depending on whether it's egg laying season or, you know, other various behaviors that are different. And then lastly, their environment varies. So tropical birds have a lower basal metabolic rate than birds that hang out in higher latitudes like Minnesota. So if you take a basal metabolic rate is like your lowest metabolic rate while you're alive. And if you take a bird from the tropics, it's just lower than the lowest basal metabolic rate compared to, you know, a bird from Minnesota. And so we do see patterns of birds' metabolic rates just varies with all kinds of different factors, okay? So ultimately, what birds have to do is balance all these things, right? They have to balance the energy that's coming in versus the energy that's going out. So that's energy intake, that's food basically, and then energy expenditure or output, which is happening with flying and singing and moving and just being alive, right? So we've discovered that there are some energy expensive activities, and these probably won't surprise you, but looking for food is energy expensive. Flying is very energy expensive, requires a lot. Temperature maintenance, especially for birds in the winter. If you're a little chickadee that stays here in the winter, you're spending a lot of energy to stay warm. Digest. Oh goodness, I apologize for this. I don't know why I keep yawning. Digestion. So digesting your meal, again, we said specific dynamic action is energy expensive, singing is energy expensive, and molting or growing new feathers is energy expensive. Compared to energy efficient activities, sitting on your eggs, sleeping, resting, or being on the ground and walking, right? So every bird is at all times in their life having to balance how much food have I eaten, how much energy do I have to sing, defend my territory, and find food and migrate. And so they, like we, are having to constantly balance energy in versus energy out. And the metabolism of birds has a big influence on their ability to balance that. So kind of a lot I tried to squeeze into a little bit. It's like a month worth of content that we could have expanded on and talked about in more detail that we just brushed over. So I hope that was interesting. You have a better sense now for their diet and their physiology. Let me know if you have questions. We'll talk again soon.